When I hear the phrase seven wonders of the world, not only the image of monuments is born in my head, but a whole universe of emotions: admiration, surprise, even a slight sadness. These structures are a trace of the greatest efforts of people, their ambitions and faith, but almost all of them were gone. Why? It is a question of how the world is changing, what memory means, and how the values of the past collide with the practical necessity of the present. I wanted to walk through these places in my mind and understand, how did it happen that almost all this splendor disappeared from the historical scene? And in this video, I'll tell you a story based on facts, archaeological finds, and logical conclusions about what happened to each miracle and why we can't see each one today. It is important for me to clarify that by seven wonders, we do not mean an official register, but a cultural construct. In ancient times, travelers and writers noted things that struck them during their travels, and these notes gradually formed lists. Sometimes these lists differed from each other. Sometimes they included objects that were omitted in other versions. So when I start a story, I always keep in mind that part of what we call fact is the result of repeated retellings, exaggerations, and literary tradition. For me, this is an important caveat. Fact and legend often go hand in hand. When I think about hanging gardens, I first turn on the cinema in my mind. Multi-tiered terraces, water, trees, as if mountains grow in the desert. This is the image that lives in us through stories. But let's get this straight. Archaeology doesn't always confirm poetry. In classical Babylon, archaeologists in the 20th century discovered impressive remains of terraces, canals, and wells. But there is little direct evidence that they correspond to the famous hanging gardens in the classical description. Moreover, studies of Assyrian capitals, Nineveh in particular, have shown the presence of terraces and water supply systems, which could be the source of descriptions mixed up in oral and written retellings. The Hanging Gardens, as the ancients say, were built by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II for his wife Amidus, who missed the greenery of her homeland. I can imagine how difficult it was to create such a garden in one of the hottest and driest regions in the world. It wasn't just a flower bed, it was an engineering masterpiece, multi-tiered terraces with an elaborate irrigation system that fed water from the Euphrates high up. The problem is that there are still no archaeological finds that clearly confirm the existence of hanging gardens. This is one of the biggest mysteries of history. Maybe it was a myth, or maybe it was a reality lost in time. The first and main enemy is time and nature. Once Babylon's power faltered and the empire collapsed, maintaining such a complex irrigation system became impossible. Without regular maintenance, even the most magnificent gardens are destroyed. Also, given that Babylon was in a zone of constant wars, including with the Persians and later with Alexander the Great, the gardens probably suffered from military destruction and looting. Alexander, according to legend, was impressed by the gardens, but already saw them in a state of decline. In addition, over the centuries, the level of the Euphrates River changed, and if the water supply system was disrupted, the terraces dried up and crumbled, especially since the garden was built on artificial structures made of brick and wood, which could not withstand thousands of years. Finally, the final blow was the change of cultures and religions in the region. New conquerors and civilizations either did not attach importance to the ancient wonders or simply used them as building materials for their own buildings. As a result, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon disappeared as mysteriously as they appeared. There was only a memory in written sources and inspiration for many artists and writers. Hanging gardens are a symbol of lost paradise, an image that inspired artists, poets, and cinematographers. Even if they were just a myth, it has become so influential that today the gardens are present in school textbooks, travel brochures, and the imaginations of millions of people. Hanging gardens are an example of how human memory can transform a real or fictional structure into a symbol that has outlived its material basis. When I think of the statue of Zeus at Olympia, I think of a grandiose creation that symbolized the power and grandeur of the ancient Greek pantheon. Created by the great sculptor Phidias in the 5th century BC, this statue was a real miracle of art and religious worship. About 12 meters high, decorated with gold and ivory, it struck not only with scale, but also with grace. However, despite its greatness, the fate of the statue was tragic and full of mysteries. Already by the 4th century AD, with the spread of Christianity and the gradual prohibition of pagan cults, the Temple of Zeus in Olympia began to lose its importance. At the same time, the protection of the monument collapsed. According to some versions, the statue was transported to Constantinople, the new political and cultural heart of the Roman Empire. There, she could be in one of the imperial residences. However, its further fate is shrouded in darkness. It is believed that in one of the fires that repeatedly occurred in Constantinople in the 5th or 6th centuries, the statue was destroyed. Fires in ancient cities were disastrous, and the fragile materials, gold and ivory, could not preserve much in such conditions. Other hypotheses suggest that over time, jewelry and valuable materials were dismantled and melted down, and the wooden frame and main parts of the statue collapsed or were lost. This is quite logical. After all, gold has always been a valuable resource, especially during periods of political instability and wars. Even in the absence of the original, the statue became the standard of divine beauty. Her descriptions inspired Renaissance artists, and images of Zeus sitting on a throne can be traced in monumental art up to the 20th century. For me, this story is a reminder of how fragile even the most impressive creations of human genius can be in the face of historical change. The statue of Zeus has disappeared as a material object, but its spirit, beauty, and cultural significance live on in the descriptions of ancient writers, inspiring artists and sculptors for centuries. So when I think about the fate of the statue of Zeus, I see not only the loss, but also the power of a legacy that cannot be destroyed. It passes from the material world to the world of ideas and memory. Imagine a building so magnificent that ancient travelers called it the most magnificent of all. The Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was not just a religious center, but also a symbol of the city's wealth and cultural influence. When I think of the Temple of Artemis, I immediately imagine not just a beautiful building, but a symbol of an entire era, one of the most important religious centers of the ancient world. But as often happens with great monuments, its fate was complex and tragic. To begin with, the first temple dedicated to Artemis was built in the 7th century BC. Imagine this, the temple was not just a religious building, it was a real financial center of that time. Inside were huge treasures. Someone literally trusted him with their valuables, as banks do today. However, fate was cruel. In 356 BC, the temple burned down completely. And what is surprising, on the same night Alexander the Great was born, and the temple burned down because of one person, Stratus, who deliberately set fire to it. He wanted to be famous at all costs, and although the authorities tried to erase his name from memory, it is this name that has come down to us through the centuries. This story is an excellent example of how a person's thirst for fame can leave an imprint on history much stronger than the greatness of buildings. But why did the temple burn down so easily? The fact is that the architecture of that time included many wooden elements, and oil lamps burned inside, and when the flame appeared, it spread quickly, destroying the building. After the fire, the people of Ephesus did not despair. They decided to build the temple anew, and this was already a different scale. The new temple became one of the largest in the ancient world. Its columns rose more than 18 meters, and the length exceeded 110 meters. Interestingly, Alexander the Great himself offered to help with finances, but the inhabitants proudly refused, believing that the deity should be worshipped independently of one person. However, the joy didn't last forever. In the 3rd century AD, Asia Minor was invaded by the Goths, barbarian tribes who knew no mercy. In 262, the Goths sacked Ephesus and destroyed the temple, removing precious metals and decorating monuments. Although the temple wasn't completely destroyed, its splendor was gone forever. But the final straw was Christianization. At the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius banned pagan cults, and the temple was finally abandoned. Columns and stones were dismantled and used for new buildings. This is a typical fate of many ancient monuments when epochs and religions change. Over time, the place where the temple stood was almost wiped off the face of the earth. The river changed its course, and everything was flooded. It was only many centuries later, in the 19th century, that archaeologist John Turtle Wood was able to find and reconstruct part of this great story. If you think about it, this is a whole chain of reasons. The arson of Herostratus as a symbol of human pettiness, then barbaric invasions, the cruel reality of the era, religious changes, the fate of civilizations, and finally, the force of nature, which took away traces of its former greatness. The Temple of Artemis was a place of pilgrimage, a shopping center, and a treasure vault. Today, there are only fragments of the foundation and one restored column, but its image lives on in art and historical reconstructions. The Temple of Artemis is a reminder that even the most beautiful building can disappear if it is confronted with the ambitions of people and the flow of history. When I think of the Mausoleum in Halicarnassus, I think of not just a tomb, but a real architectural masterpiece, a monument that became a symbol of love, power, and art of its time. But, like many great monuments of antiquity, it has endured a long and difficult history of destruction. Built around 350 BC by order of Carius Mausolus in memory of his wife Artemisia, the mausoleum was impressive not only for its size, about 45 meters in height, but also for its magnificent decoration. Marble columns, sculptures by great masters, and complex architecture that inspired generations. It is believed that it was the word mausoleum that became a household name thanks to this structure. But how did this masterpiece end up in ruins? The first thing to understand is that Halicarnassus, the modern city of Bodrum in Turkey, is located in an earthquake-prone region. Over the centuries, the ground here has repeatedly shaken. Earthquakes repeatedly struck the structure. The first significant damage probably appeared in the early Middle Ages. In addition to natural disasters, an important factor was the change in the political and religious situation. With the collapse of the Hellenistic world and the establishment of the power of the Romans, and later the Byzantine Empire, the mausoleum gradually lost its significance and went into oblivion. But the real blow was dealt by the Ottomans in the 15th century when they began to build fortresses and castles to protect the coastal territories of the empire. It was in 1494 that Sultan Bayezid II ordered the use of marble slabs and sculptures of the mausoleum for the construction of the fortress of Sayan, Peter in Halicarnassus. The greatest miracle of architecture turns into building materials for military fortifications. This act was not unique for that time. The fate of many ancient monuments that became victims of pragmatism was repeated. Over time, partially destroyed and dismantled, the mausoleum finally lost its former appearance. The remains of its architecture, fragments of sculptures and columns, became the object of archaeological excavations, which began only in the 19th century. The Mausoleum in Halicarnassus became a symbol of the architectural synthesis of cultures and gave the world the very word mausoleum. His images can be found in architecture from the Taj Mahal to Lenin in the Mausoleum on Red Square. For me, this story is a story of the clash of eternal beauty and changing history, where the power of nature, changing cultures, and political realities are closely intertwined, destroying great creations. I also see here a lesson about the value of materials. In times of economic difficulties, ancient structures are considered as storerooms of building materials. This is a pragmatic approach, but it often leads to the loss of unique works. When I imagine the Colossus of Rhodes, the image of a giant immediately pops up in my head, as if the island itself raised its hand. But if you look carefully, this is not just a beautiful legend, but a complex engineering and economic history, which I want to put on the shelves. The Colossus was built in the early 3rd century BC to commemorate the victory of the people of Rhodes over the siege led by the famous Demetrius Poliorcetes. This project united the island's forces. Metal was collected even from military equipment captured in battle. Master Jerez from Lind created a giant bronze statue which, according to various estimates, reached from 25 to 36 meters in height, a real engineering and artistic sensation of its time. What happened next? Alas, this beauty did not last long. Around 226 BC, Rhodes was shaken by a powerful earthquake. Its power was devastating for the Colossus. The statue, despite its massive frame and bronze shell, could not stand it and collapsed. But it's not just the instantaneous crash that's interesting, but what happened next. Despite the destruction, the people of Rhodes decided not to restore the statue. They believed that recovery would bring failure. That was the zeitgeist. Moreover, even the fragments of the Colossus lying on the ground became a tourist attraction. Legends about its size and strength lived for a long time. Later, the metal from the wreckage, according to one version, was taken to Egypt. There, allegedly, it was taken on 900 camels. The story of the camels is more of a myth, but it clearly shows how valuable bronze was and how practical needs could affect the fate of the monument. Why is this important for our story? Because the Colossus is a perfect example of several cross-cutting causes of the destruction of such monuments. A natural disaster, in our case an earthquake, which in our case is the main catalyst, economic rationality. The metal was valuable and therefore much needed, and cultural transformation. Gradually, the symbolism is changing and the society does not see the need to restore the old heritage to its former form. The Colossus, even felled, became part of the tourist route of antiquity, then medieval stories, later an inspiration for artists and architects. The image of the Colossus is a mixture of pride, tragedy, and practicality. For me, this story is a vivid example of how nature and time can change the fate of even the most grandiose structures. The Colossus of Rhodes is not just a monument, but a symbol of the fragility of human creations in the face of the elements. Although the bronze statue collapsed, its image and legend live on in our imagination, inspiring generations. When I think of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, I see one of the most impressive engineering projects of antiquity, which not only served as a guide for sailors, but also symbolized the power and ambition of the Hellenistic world. I imagine not just a tower, but a huge complex machine, a huge stone structure inside which people worked every day to radiate light and order in the dark sea night. Built in the 3rd century BC on the island of Pharos, this lighthouse, rising to about 120 meters, was a real miracle of its time. However, the history of the lighthouse is full of tragedies related to natural disasters and historical events, that slowly but surely destroyed its greatness. Why did the lighthouse die gradually? Unlike the sudden falls of bronze statues, the lighthouse survived for centuries and died not quickly, but painfully. Several strong earthquakes that occurred since the 4th century AD caused serious damage to it. The first damage to the lighthouse was probably caused by an earthquake in 956, which greatly shook Alexandria. Later, in the 12th century, a series of subsequent aftershocks continued to destroy the structure. By that time, the lighthouse had already been partially destroyed and was losing its former power. In addition, in the 11th to 12th centuries, during the Crusades and political wars, the fortifications around Alexandria used the wreckage of the lighthouse to repair and build defensive structures. The value of building materials exceeded the value of the monument itself. In the end, by the 15th century, the lighthouse was in ruins and finally disappeared after earthquakes, but its image remained in the minds of generations. Later, in the 16th century, the Ottomans built the fortress of Kite Bay on the same site, a kind of new security structure that replaced the ancient lighthouse. It should be mentioned that the name Pharos has entered many languages as a synonym for lighthouse, so strongly did the Lighthouse of Alexandria influence medieval maritime culture. The monument was a symbol of the city's commercial power and technical prowess. Its use as a material for the construction of the Kite Bay fortress in later times is a rather vivid illustration of cyclicity. The stone, which was a symbol of the open path, later went to a defensive structure. In my understanding, the history of the Lighthouse of Alexandria is a story of the ongoing struggle of man with nature and time. Even the most grandiose structures do not last forever, but their cultural, architectural, and engineering heritage still lives on and inspires. The pyramids are a special chapter. They have come down to us in the material more than anyone else because their structure, huge monolithic blocks, was difficult to disassemble and repurpose. When you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is hard to believe that it is a structure more than 4,500 years old. It has survived empires, wars, and climate disasters, and still towers over the sands of Egypt. For me, this pyramid is a symbol of how perseverance, organization, and engineering can challenge time itself. But this does not mean that they are infinite or invulnerable. The Great Pyramid was built in the 26th century BC under the pharaoh Khufu, Cheops. It was the center of a complex of temples, satellite pyramids, and piers connected to the Nile. Its original height, about 147 meters, made it the tallest building on Earth for almost 4,000 years. And it is important to remember, this is not just a tomb, but a monumental embodiment of the cult of divine rule. The construction required millions of blocks of limestone and granite, some weighing up to 80 tons. There are still disputes about how these boulders were raised. The most popular theory is a system of inclined ramps, straight or spiral, possibly combined, and there are hypotheses about the use of internal corridors for transportation. The pyramid did not collapse, but over the centuries, it has lost much of its original appearance. The most notable loss is the smooth cladding removed in the Middle Ages for construction in Cairo. Desert winds and earthquakes also contributed to its erosion. The top, the pyramidion, has disappeared, and today the height of the pyramid is about 138 meters. The Great Pyramid has become a symbol of Egypt and one of the main mysteries of archaeology. It has inspired ancient historians, Arab travelers, European artists, and modern researchers. Even today, it is studied using laser scanning, radar, and robotics. Each new method brings discoveries, voids, hidden corridors, traces of construction. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the only one of the 7 wonders of the world that has survived to this day. And perhaps That's why it reminds us that man can create something that will outlive even his own civilization. If you combine all these stories, then a clear pattern emerges. Monuments die not only from one external factor, but from a combination of natural and human elements. These include earthquakes, fires, wars, religious changes, and the pragmatism of those who come later and need resources. The main lesson for me is that conservation requires a conscious choice of society. Without institutional memory, without financial and cultural support, the most solid stone machinery will still disintegrate. And again, the disappearance of form is not equal to the disappearance of knowledge. Stones go to new buildings, artifacts go to museums, and research and digital reconstructions bring back the image of the past. It is important for us to preserve not only the stones, but also knowledge, descriptions, plans, research, so that the next era can understand what we once had. I end where I started. Miracles are people's footprints. As long as we remember and study, they are still alive. If you enjoyed this trip, subscribe, like, and write a comment if you want to see individual episodes about each ancient wonder of the world. Thank you for coming this way with me.